So welcome everyone. Tonight we are having a wonderful presentation by our Executive Director, Dr. Jason Carmel of the Weinberg Family Center. Dr. Carmel has a wealth of knowledge around cerebral palsy, neurology, all of the things that you can experience with this wonderful person that we all get to work alongside, and really bringing us all together at the Weinberg Family Cerebral Palsy Center to work in an interdisciplinary manner. So Dr. Carmel has led our center in an era where I truly say that we're really seeing multidisciplinary at its best. Thanks to Dr. Carmel, we have been able to include psychiatry and so many other things that are coming up in our center, which we will talk about a little bit more at the end. But for right now, we're going to start the conversation with 3 myths about cerebral palsy, which is more of like a nice introductory, relaxed conversation where we just want you to hear from our wonderful executive director. And then from there, you all get to ask all the questions you'd like. Just the presentation will be recorded, not the question and answer portion. That's how folks can feel free to ask questions, unmute if they'd like to speak. And at that point, the other thing that I'd like to add, let me stop sharing my screen. The other thing that I'd like to add as part of this presentation is that Dr. Carmel can't answer any specific medical questions when it comes to your health. He could only really go based off of like what's the research, what's really talked about in the CP world. But if you'd like to disclose, which we don't encourage you, it's up to you. If you'd like to disclose about your personal history, you're allowed to. Dr. Carmel, he can only really answer just based off of like what the research is on the CP and answer it more generally instead of your specific experience. So with that being said, I will allow our wonderful executive director, Dr. Jason Carmel, present 3 myths about CP.
Thanks so much, Minnelly. That was a generous introduction, and I think you all can get a sense of the spirit that Minnelly and the amazing staff at the CP Center bring. I think that there's the work we do is both very challenging and immensely rewarding, and made even more so by being able to work with people like Minnelly. When I talk about CP and some updates about sort of what's new or interesting in CP, I think it's taking this approach about what the myths about CP are can be helpful. And so here's the cat is out of the bag here. Here are the 3 myths that we're going to talk about. But I'm going to start with a little bit of just a little bit of an introduction. I'm sure people are here because they've, have a dedicated interest. Many folks, I'm sure, have cerebral palsy. And but let me just kind of lay the groundwork for those of you who are newer to the world. So what defines cerebral palsy? It's this sort of very large umbrella of terms. You have to have an impairment of movement or posture and it has to impair your function. It has to be due to an injury of the developing brain in the first 3 years of life. And critically, there's this component of a non-progressive injury, which we'll get into in detail later. So it's the most common physical disability in childhood, about 2 or 3 per 1,000 births. And there are close to a million people in the US with CP, the majority of whom are adults. I'm recognizing now that I have children's health on the bottom part of my slide left over from a previous talk, but this is addressing folks, both kids and adults. And in fact, the logo of our center is a bridge, and it's meant to symbolize bridging the care of people from pediatrics into adulthood. What causes CP? It's really a multifactorial, but here in sort of a large series of people, obstetricians trying to understand what the causes are. Prematurity is the thing that really leaps out. That's the number one risk factor. Kids being born small, intrauterine growth retardation, IUGR, infections, hemorrhage. So you can read the list here. I'll just bring your attention to this bottom part, the cryptogenic, meaning we as doctors aren't smart enough to figure out why it happened. And that's about 10 to 15%. And we'll discuss that more as things go on. So just to kind of give you a little bit more sense, so the more premature a baby is, the more likely they are to have CP. And you can see that for babies born less than 28 weeks of gestation, there's nearly 100 per, nearly 1 in 10 will have CP. As you get older to full term, it goes down to about 1 in 1,000. And the same it holds for birth weight, which is they're related but independent. And so the smaller the baby, the higher risk for CP. So let's get into the myths. So as a neurologist in training, I was told that CP is an acquired injury. You were born premature, you had a bleed, you had an infection, and that's the reason that you have CP. And increasingly, there's this recognition that there may be some genetic susceptibility, but with the new information that there are a certain number of people who have CP due to a genetic variant, we asked a very sort of important question about who we should test, who with cerebral palsy should have genetic testing as to try to figure out what the basis of their CP is. So we ended up in a partnership with the Institute for Genomic Medicine here at Columbia, and we created an idea that could be tested, a hypothesis that individuals without risk factors for their CP would have a significantly higher number of genetic variants than people with risk factors for CP, right? So if you didn't have prematurity, if you weren't small, if you didn't have an infection in utero, then you're more likely to have CP due to a genetic cause. And so we tested this by recruiting all of the patients who came to us at the CP center. And that included people both with and without risk factors for CP. And then we did this genetic technique called whole exome sequencing, WES. WES means that all of the DNA in the cells is sequenced, all the DNA that codes for a protein. So there are about 30,000 proteins, and we look at all the DNA that codes for those proteins. And then we asked, all right, did you have these 5 risk factors: prematurity, bleed, asphyxia, brain malformations, or an infection? And then we, with our partners in the Institute for Genomic Medicine, we reviewed, which of the genetic variants might be related to CP. And we discovered that that there were significant numbers of people who had a genetic variant that was likely the reason that they had their CP in both groups, both the groups with risk factors and those without. And there was no significant difference in the diagnostic rate between these two groups. Like most of our scientific studies, the ones that the main hypothesis is proved wrong is the most interesting. So there is a slightly higher rate of CP in those without risk factors, as we were saying, but this didn't reach statistical significance. And there was still 8% of the participants with risk factors, meaning they were born premature or they were born very small or had intrauterine infections. And so this made us think that, we should be potentially testing more people. There were other interesting associations that if a child had more global developmental delay, that was associated with the genetic etiology. And if they were very premature, had a stroke, or were older age at birth, those were negatively associated with having a genetic variant. So this was published in the journal that's associated with the American Academy of Cerebral Palsy and Developmental Medicine. And an accompanying commentary said, well, maybe we should be doing genetic testing in all people with cerebral palsy. And that's essentially what we've turned to. And it's fortunate that there's a company now that's looking for a rare genetic form of cerebral palsy that will do this for free. And so we've had luck, doing this genetic screening in our patients of all ages. So that's the first myth about CP. The second myth is that CP is non-progressive. And I think you'll remember from when I was speaking earlier about the definition of CP. It's a injury of the developing brain that impairs movement or posture. And that injury is supposed to be non-progressive, meaning it's not one of these rare degenerative diseases of childhood. But this little phrase, non-progressive, gets us in trouble because, in fact, a lot of the symptoms of CP do change. So this idea of non-progressive arose out of the need to distinguish from the degenerative diseases. That was really talking about the change in the brain, but there are changes in symptoms. So the symptoms change during development because as we develop, lots of our behaviors change. We start to walk, we start to talk. Those behaviors come online because neural connections have formed in people with cerebral palsy, some who don't develop walking or talking. Their symptoms can still change because those neural connections are still maturing. And as they mature, the type of tone and the type of function that they have can change with age as well. So here's an interesting study. Leave it to the Scandinavians to have 50 years of follow-up in this large cohort in Sweden. And what they showed, they looked at a registry of people with CP and they asked, do their symptoms change? And there's a lot of things that stay the same, particularly in the highest functioning and the lowest functioning people. But particularly in the middle, for those of you who are familiar with this GMFCS scale, we're talking about 2, 3, and 4, or at least 2 and 3, that though they changed, and the pattern of change was usually diminished function over time. And particularly for the folks on the call who are adults with CP, I don't need to tell you that whereas that folks can start to lose, have increasing difficulty in with movements, even in teens, 20s, 30s. And so it's the lived experience of lots of folks with CP. This is an epidemiology that kind of bears it out. And then the last myth about CP that I wanted to talk about is this idea that we can treat the symptoms, but not the cause. So everybody knows that the cause of CP is an injury to the developing brain. And I'm part of the CP Center in part because my goal is to change the brain to improve connections, particularly between the brain and the spinal cord, in order to improve function, particularly of the arm and hand. So here's a dizzying chart here. It's got this nice traffic light motif in that studies that work are green, studies that are in between are yellow, and studies that are definitely don't work and we shouldn't do are red. and I'll just kind of overlay. So on the left, you can see these are the various therapies, right? Mobility training, constraint therapy of the arm, treadmill training. The others deal with tone management, so injections like Botox injection or selective dorsal rhizotomy. And then for dealing with contractures or alignment, there's serial casting and surgery. Those are the things that work to help people with CP. And the size of these bubbles, by the way, are related to the number of trials. So the larger number of trials, for instance, the big bubble is 15, and then the smaller number of trials as the size of the bubbles goes down. And so I guess the main point here is that we can do therapies which do end up changing the nervous system. Most of us think about therapies treating muscle or treating joints, but as a neurologist, I see the repetitive practice as strengthening nervous system connections. But predominantly, we're not talking about direct treatment of the nervous system. And so the myth I'm hoping to bust here is to try to talk about therapies directed at the nervous system. So a common neurological phenotype, a symptom that many of you may have on this call, is spasticity. Spasticity is this rate-dependent increase in tone, meaning if the doctor pushes your foot up, your calf catches. It may even have this sort of bouncing movement or clonus. And that's all due to a problem with the reflexes, right? So as the muscle is stretched, it sends information back to the spinal cord and causes muscle contraction, which is spasticity. The faster you move the limb, the more sensory input goes back to the spinal cord, the more the muscle contracts. That's why spasticity is this rate-dependent increase in tone. Faster you move, the more spastic you are. So the current treatments involve either decreasing activity, particularly with anti-spasticity drugs, or intrathecal baclofen. So this is an anti-spasticity drug, baclofen, that goes directly around the spinal cord. We can interrupt this reflex loop either by cutting the dorsal root, so-called rhizotomy. People may have heard about selective dorsal rhizotomy. We can damage the peripheral nerves to increase the reflex loop, or we can give Botox, which affects the neuromuscular junction, meaning nerve to muscle communication is weakened. So all of those really are trying to diminish the spasticity, but they don't actually treat the nervous system. I and my lab have been very interested in directing treatments towards the spinal cord. And it's probably not a surprise to many of you that we would turn towards the spinal cord, in particular because some of our treatments for CP are directed at the spinal cord. So here's on the left is a representation of the spinal cord. Here's that reflex loop that I was telling you about, that the sensory information comes in and then the muscle contracts because of that. In selective dorsal rhizotomy, these electrodes are used to identify the roots here or the rootlets that are most responsible for the spasticity, and the neurosurgeon cuts the rootlets that are most involved and therefore stops that reflex arc. Here's a pump that puts baclofen just in and around the spinal cord. So these are treatments that are directed at the spinal cord, giving us the sense that that might be a reasonable target. So we and others have been interested in using electrical stimulation of the spinal cord in order to try to modulate its function. So in one iteration of this, electrodes are put on the back and the front, and a current is run in between the two. And so this is passing electricity through the body with electrodes over the part of the spinal cord that's important for leg control and for walking. So here are the electrodes over the lumbar spinal cord, again, that key portion for standing, walking, and leg tone. And this can be combined with all sorts of different therapies. Here's a robotic walking setup. So a randomized controlled trial was performed. These are the participants showing that there are GMFCS 2s, 3s, and 4s, and balanced between the group that got the stimulation and the group that got no stimulation. And what you can observe is that that there was, in the group that got the stimulation, they moved from up on this GMFM scale up by 8 points, but there was no change in the control group. So the folks with stimulation got better, the folks without stimulation did not. So one problem with movement in CP is that muscles contract together. So if one looks at series of muscles, so here's a quadriceps muscle, and here's a hamstring muscle, here's the front of the lower leg, here's the back of the lower leg. In healthy participants, those alternate, all right, with the gait cycle. So these two alternate and these two alternate. And what you see is in a person with CP, they have co-contraction, right? There's not this nice alternating of muscle contractions between agonist and antagonist pairs. After the treatment, they're able to control the muscles better and have better knee movement and less co-contraction. And so in medicine, we also often talk about a minimally clinically important difference. And in this case, this gross motor function measure. In the control group, 2 of the 15 participants got this minimally clinically important difference. In the stimulation group, 9 out of 13 did. So lots of folks who made that important difference in their movement in the stim group, but not in the control group. So electrical stimulation has multiple applications. I just told you about walking, but there's also standing or arm and hand function. And the way we look at how electrical spinal cord stimulation works is we look at this physiology, the muscle activity in healthy participants. In folks whose legs are mostly affected, the diplegia, we can look at their reflexes, spasticity, and co-contraction, as I just went through with you. For people with hemiplegia or quadriplegia, we can also look at arm and hand spasticity and movement of reach to grasp, let's say. So, so what I've told you tonight is that, here are the sort of myths turned on their heads. So we'll talk about 3 truths, and the kids gave no lies. So CP likely has a large genetic component. In our study, it was, between 10 and 15% of people had a genetic variant. And, we're just scratching the surface. We're part of a national consortium looking at the genetic roles. And I think together we can hopefully uncover what exactly it is that drives the genetic component of CP. Change in symptoms during the course of CP is the rule. The injury to the nervous system is non-progressive, but the change in symptoms is what we see every day in the clinic. And that treatment of the nervous system is possible, and we're part of a multi-center trial that's just getting going for restoration of movement in kids with CP. So for those of you who are joining us just for the first time, we are here for all your needs, for your medical needs. As Minnelly mentioned at the beginning, we have the most, my patient's guardian angel and Jennifer Pimentel, who's our care coordinator. For those of you who are joining, perhaps being a part of the carers rather than being a person with CP, we have access to training and expertise. Here are the ways to get in touch with the center and my email. And I'm delighted to take any questions that anybody has.
Forgot I was muted. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation, Dr. Carmel. So at this point, I'm going to stop recording the presentation. That's how folks feel comfortable to unmute themselves and talk if they'd like to.